But the question is, for all of the other thousands of platforms that are out there that have neither the technology, the money, nor perhaps the will to do some of the things that we've heard about over the last few days, how do you address that issue? How do you solve that problem? And we have a wonderful panel who's going to be talking about that. Come on up. Who is going to be talking about how do we address these issues? How do we help other smaller places do this work that needs to be done? Because one of the things we know from human nature is where there are bad actors who cannot operate, they won't just stop, they will move to another place where they are not thwarted. And so how do we make sure that doesn't happen, and how do we make sure that efforts to eradicate hate actually eradicate it rather than just mobilize it? So with that, we have a wonderful panel that is chaired by Lorrie Cranor, the co-chair of the Collaboratory. And Lorrie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Wow, we're almost at the end. I think we're all exhausted, but excited and energized. So thank you all who are still here sticking it out. It's been exciting to see all the people who've come here to Pittsburgh from around the world, as well as my friends from Pittsburgh who are here locally, and everybody online. We have two panelists online here, so this will be exciting. We'll see if they can actually dialogue with each other. Hopefully that the technology will kick in and it will all work. So on this panel, we're going to try to be pretty conversational, and we will try to address some of the questions that Laura asked, and we may actually go beyond that in trying to sum up some of the ideas that we've heard over the past 3 days, and trying to come up with some paths forward. So to start with, let me have the panelists all introduce themselves. I'll start. So as Laura said, my name is Lorrie Cranor. I am the co-director of the Collaboratory Against Hate, which is a research center jointly at Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. I'm at Carnegie Mellon in the School of Computer Science and the Engineering and Public Policy Department.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Newman. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot. You've heard from one of my colleagues already a couple of times this week. I was previously the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security. You've heard from some of the people that I worked with over the last couple of years to create the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. So it's a particular passion of mine for us to build that prevention capability. And so I'm pleased to be here today.
I'm Davidgarten Ross. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Valens Global. My background is as an analyst and scholar working on counterterrorism issues and violent non-state actors. I founded Valens in 2014 because I felt like there's more that we could offer in the space, and I've been privileged to do a lot of really interesting work in that regard, building a great team. And Elizabeth and I first got to know one another back in 2019 when we worked on DHS's strategic framework for countering terrorism and targeted violence together. It's work like that that makes my time at Valens so gratifying.
Great. And Amar?
Hi, everyone. I'm Amarnath Amarsingham, Assistant Professor in the School of Religion and cross-listed to Political Studies at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. I'm also a fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. I mostly work on jihadism, foreign fighters, and issues of online community and the sociology of religion.
And Nick.
Hey, my name is Nick Pickles. I lead Twitter's public policy, strategy, development, and partnerships team. And what that really means is my team is both engaging with our product and trust and safety teams every day on how we tackle some of these problems, but also working very closely with partners in civil society, multi-stakeholder processes to build the kind of partnerships that are actually going to help us solve these problems together. And then thinking about how Twitter addresses some of the most pressing public policy challenges, like protecting the open internet at a global policy level as well.
Great. Okay, so let's start with some questions. So we've heard a lot of different perspectives on eradicating hate. We've heard from lawyers, we've heard from educators, we've heard from law enforcement, we've heard from all sorts of different communities. So let's focus on the malevolent platforms. What should we be doing to eradicate hate? And let's start with Elizabeth, and we'll go down the line.
Well, holding this conference is a huge part of it, right? Just getting everybody in the room, and we all have different perspectives and different angles on the problem, and I think that in and of itself is a major accomplishment. It's very hard to get busy people in the same room at the same time to talk about these problems. But on the specific aspect of malevolent platforms, it's late in the day. Couple of thoughts. One, you've heard from my colleague Vidya about some of the redirect efforts that Moonshot has undertaken over the last 6 years, and there are some other efforts that the platforms themselves have taken where we're able to, with better granularity, identify those individuals that are in the process of radicalizing. They're seeking out harmful content. And we're learning how to target the right messaging to them. If you flash back 10 years ago, we all thought intervention meant countering the ideology. You had to counter message the hate that they were going after. And what we have learned is that it's not usually about the ideology. It is much more about other unmet needs that need to be addressed. It's what's driving them to seek out the violence, seek out the hate. So in the online space, one of the things that I think we can do better, we can actually help offline individuals that are doing that work on the one-to-one counseling. In the online space, you have the ability to test messaging at scale and figure out what works for different types of audiences. So for example, in Indonesia, high-risk users were 128% more likely to engage with ads offering support for loneliness rather than traditional counter-narrative content. In Albania, users at risk of violent jihadism were more likely to engage with ads that offered support for users dealing with feelings of uncertainty rather than ads that were used that appealed to other emotions, anger, stress, loneliness. In the US, we found that users searching for content related to armed groups and conspiracy theories, such as the Boogaloo movement, had a higher propensity to click on advertisements designed to elicit an emotional response. And those ads redirected people to that crisis text line we talked about. So I think it's something to explore that perhaps by bringing some of this to scale, we have the ability to more quickly equip the offline counselor with some of that knowledge that in a different setting, if you were to just try to do this through a traditional research methodology, it might take too long because the environment in which people are operating online is moving so quickly, and the context that we were operating in, say, in the pandemic was very different than what we were dealing with 3 years ago and what we might be dealing with next year. So being able to use the online space to test those messages may help our offline partners be able to better target and figure out how to address the underlying needs that might be going on with a particular violent extremist community.
Great. David, would you like to go next?
Yeah, it's, first of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be here. I know all of us were, so hurt by the Tree of Life attack. And it's amazing to see not only how the community came together here, but how it's taking that extraordinarily tragic event and trying to use it as a springboard to solutions. I agree with Elizabeth strongly about the amazing array of people who are here and the amazing array of capabilities and disciplines that are brought together. With respect to malevolent platforms specifically, and we're talking platforms that exist to propagate hate. Such platforms have been created with a variety of colorful names. Gab, for example, is one of the best known. But I put forward 3 principles. The first one is to limit the number of ideas that we consider to be out of bounds. Paradoxically, the more you put out of bounds, the more people will end up on those malevolent platforms. Now, that doesn't answer any given case, right? It's always hard to determine where the lines are or when someone is crossed into being a dangerous individual or a purveyor of speech that is out of bounds. But generally speaking, I think the more people are considered within bounds, the more our resilient community will prosper. The more people who are out of bounds, the bigger the malevolent platforms become. Secondly, civil liability is important. I think that when it comes to the major platforms, the Facebooks and the Twitters, you have people like Brian Fishman and like Nick here who are doing very good work to try to make sure that the platforms are not used as a springboard for violence. Overall, the work of those platforms can definitely be critiqued, and I have plenty of my own critiques. But civil liability in that context, I think, is a hard case to make. When there's a platform that exists to make hateful voices heard and is used to mobilize people to violence, the case for civil liability is much stronger. And I think this conference had a very good civil liability platform or discussion, but that is a mechanism that is at the forefront of what I think should be considered part of the response. The third and final thing is, as we talk about malevolent platforms, one big set of potential legal changes that may be coming is much more robust antitrust enforcement. There are many things that we could say about antitrust from many different angles, but looking at it just from the angle of terrorist speech and hate speech and incitement to violence, it may be frustrating to deal with one Facebook and one Twitter, but if you're dealing with 20, suddenly you have so many different standards, and if you flip it to the adversarial perspective, if I'm a hate group, if I'm a terrorist group, if I'm a state that wants to spread disinformation, a multiplicity of platforms with much smaller compliance teams plays to my advantage. And I think as we talk about controversies surrounding big tech, the impact of multiplying platforms and what it would do to efforts such as those here has to be a part of the conversation.
Right, Amar?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said so far. What's interesting, I think, to think about with malevolent platforms is they often grew in popularity as a result of deplatforming, right? And so as things were as this kind of content was deplatformed from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, a lot of these other platforms grew in importance for these organizations. So if you think back to 2013, 14, 15, the Islamic State on Twitter and Facebook was quite easy to find. You can look for fighters, supporters within seconds and find people on those platforms. In late 2015, all of these mainstream platforms took active kind of action against these jihadist groups, and they all migrated to Telegram, and they set up shop in Telegram in late 2015, and that became kind of ground zero for these groups for 4 years or so. What ended up happening in November 2019 is quite important because that's when Telegram finally kind of agreed to step up to the plate, worked closely with Europol, and kicked them off the platform, right? And so me and Shiraz Maher and Charlie Winter wrote a report for earlier this year, which I can send to people if they contact me, where you can actually see ISIS content on Telegram just fall off a cliff, right? With the Europol campaign, it just kind of disappeared. And that lasted for several months afterwards. But where they went is also quite important. They migrated to Hoop Messenger and TamTam and Rocket Chat. Luckily, those other platforms also kind of reacted very quickly and made sure that the environment wasn't particularly hospitable. If you compare that to how it's going on the far right, the same thing happened on the far right. They got kicked off the mainstream platforms over time. We saw after 2016, a lot of this content was removed. QAnon content was removed in 2020. But the migration to these alternative platforms like Gab, Parler, and also Telegram wasn't met with the same kind of takedown approach, deplatforming approach that jihadist groups have. So the far right on Telegram right now is massive, right? Some of these groups that I'm in, the QAnon groups that I'm in have like 225,000 members. On Gab, they have about 250,000 members. And so whatever following they had on Twitter, whatever following they had on Telegram, on Facebook, Instagram, and so on, they've managed to re-establish themselves with pretty much the same amount of numbers, particularly the influencer class of some of these groups, with the same intensity. And so I think the problem on the far right, of course, is that a lot of these platforms are themselves established by far right activists and far right actors, and so they're not going to come to the table, work with GIFCT and other networks to kind of take down this content. And so that's kind of one of the problems that we're dealing with, is that the deplatforming naturally leads to innovation, naturally leads to migration to other platforms, and those platforms don't necessarily react the same way to different ideological movements as they have in the past.
And Nick.
Well, Amarnath just really sort of teed me right up into, I think, one of the critical questions here, which is we need to be able to distinguish between platforms who have made a choice not to act and platforms who lack the capacity to act. And I think, the work of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism is a good example of how you can begin engaging with companies, mentoring them, and then looking to increase things like technical support, access to research that's coming out of organizations like the ICSR. And at that point, we can start to have a conversation about how do you deal with companies who are choosing not to engage with these issues, who are choosing not to uphold their own terms of service, their own standards. And to have that conversation, we need a much broader range of stakeholders at the table, including the infrastructure layer of the internet. So, it's no good having a situation where content can be removed because it promotes terrorism, incites violence from platforms, but then is still residually available through the wider open web because of hosting companies not taking action, because of domain registrars not taking action. So I think you need to broaden that lens out from just a handful of large platforms. But when you do that, it's essential that civil society are part of that conversation, because those infrastructure conversations, those domain conversations, do have a big impact on how the internet works at its roots. So it's really important that's a multi-stakeholder process. It isn't just something that happens between governments and private companies, particularly because governments around the world share different views as to the kinds of content we're talking about, and will exert pressure to take the narrative in one country, which is focused on violent extremism, and apply that through perhaps a domestic political lens to target opponents or journalists or human rights activists. So I think making sure that conversation is multi-stakeholder. And then really, I think one of the other questions that has come out and has started to receive some attention is also the financial incentives in this, and how do both the individual actors and the influencers and then the platforms themselves, how is that content being monetized? What are the financial incentives at play? And that again requires a broader conversation with the ad tech ecosystem, with payments companies. Now, all of this should be done in an open, transparent way with clear policies, appeal processes, and a commitment to procedural justice, which I think is very important, because we're talking about removing people's speech from the internet, which is not insignificant. The one final point, and hopefully this is an area of conversation for the panel, is I do think this is also a good opportunity to reflect on. For many years, content moderation has been you have an account or you don't have an account. We take content down, we leave content up. And one of the consequences of that is that people who may be on the fringes, who have a small number of infringements on a large platform, lose access to their accounts, and so migrate to a platform which is far less diverse ideologically, far more toxic. And I think there's a question to think about in terms of how do we improve behavior of people before they reach the point where they're suspended from a large platform. And we've been thinking about working on improving civility in a number of different ways. But then also those positive interventions that actually would make people question their direction of travel. And so I think there is a risk that as these smaller platforms become far less open to different perspectives, people who are in those communities are far more likely to hear a single perspective reinforced by different voices. Whereas if they were on a larger platform, they'd hear a greater perspective, their views would be challenged. And so there is a cost to actually removing people's access to larger platforms that I think in recent years we haven't fully understood that chain of events and the range of opportunities to intervene.
Thanks. So I've heard a lot of different stakeholders here that were just mentioned, a lot of different parties who may play a role in this. So let's go back to the major platforms, since it seems that often these groups start there, and then when they're deplatformed, then they end up on these smaller platforms. So we had a keynote speaker who accused one of them being the super spreader of hate. There's questions about whether the major platforms are doing enough. So what should the major platforms be doing? Thoughts?
Starting with me. So there's two different lenses we can look at this through. One lens is the lens of, well, in Facebook's parlance, dangerous organizations and individuals. Twitter's way of looking at it is analogous. I think that in that regard, there's a lot of things one can disagree with, but both Facebook and Twitter have very thoughtful approaches that I think, on the whole, are paradigmatically laudable. If you get to what should we be critiquing these platforms for, I'm not a big fan of the business model of the platforms writ large. How many millions of dollars do social media companies plow into studying the dopamine effect and the way that their platforms intersect with our neurotransmitters? Like, we know that there's a lot of research being done on that. I do not like people interfering with my neurotransmitters. I do not like a platform that is so gamified that you know that attacking somebody, going negative, will get you much more interactions, much more retweets, much more engagements than saying something positive. I think polarization is inherent to these platforms. And with the Facebook leaks now, we have a better idea of the fact that this is the case. So this is a much higher level than dangerous organizations and individuals or the work that Nick does. But I would like to see a much deeper discussion about what this means of engaging with people does to us as a society and what the obligations of the companies should be. Because we all know it's much easier to dehumanize other people, like either for reasons of race and religion and ethnicity or reasons of political difference on these platforms than it is when you're face-to-face. To rehumanize, often you have to get off of the internet and actually look at somebody across a table. So I think that when it comes to the biggest critique I have, in my opinion, what social media is doing to us as a society is not positive, and it is worth a discussion of what we can do to counter the ill effect of these enormously valuable industries that are making us worse thinkers and worse people the more we engage with them.
Amar, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of nature of the conversation that needs to be had about social media. I think sometimes gets stuck in these little kind of silos, I guess, and that needs to be a little bit broader than what we're having. For me, I think some of the challenges that the companies are having so I come from Sri Lanka. I'm very much linked to a lot of activist communities in different parts of the world, and what's happening in some of those communities, I think, worries me, right? I mean, we saw what happened in Myanmar with Facebook. We saw what happened in Sri Lanka and some of the misinformation that starts very locally and could have died very locally 10 years ago, pre-social media, but then has now spread across the country to cause real harm. And I think the overdependence on AI is also something that we need to think about, because I think some of that resulted from this conversation that we just had about what to do about extremist content. And the response from social media companies was to say, okay, we're going to automate some of this stuff and automate some of this detection at scale, which basically works a lot of the time, but also repeatedly has disadvantaged activist communities around the world, right? So we saw that the kind of famous early case of YouTube accidentally taking down all of the evidence of human rights abuses in Syria. We saw several Sikh activists in India complaining that farmers' protest content was being taken down. Palestinians have said the same thing. And so there's a kind of overreach that's happening, I think, with the overdependence on automation and artificial intelligence to find some of this content and take it down, and which has bizarrely led to social media companies silencing activist movements, even though some of the things that they were praised for back, during Arab Spring days was actually you gave a voice to people that never had it before, and put them on a more international setting. And so I think social media is I disagree slightly with David in that I think there's a potential for positive benefit in some of these platforms, because they create transnational communities, they create transnational movements and activism. They bring marginalized voices into the mainstream, unlike any other technology ever invented. But there is a kind of downside as well in terms of what kind of the consequences of this extremism conversation has, I think, produced, and the results that has brought about for some of these other social movements that are active.
Elizabeth?
I agree with everything that's been said so far on this question. I also want to pick up on what Nick said towards the end about the last question.
Yeah.
He was talking about, the problem is, like, when you've deplatformed an individual, like, that individual is now being exposed to worse content. So if you look at it through the lens, not necessarily of what is the company's responsibility, but how do we help that individual? In some ways, that's the worst case scenario, to move them to a place that's more toxic. Now, it prevents somebody else from being exposed to the toxicity that person was trying to propagate on one of the big platforms. That's a great thing. But what about the individual? And the problem that we keep coming back to is that every tactic and technique that we have used when it comes to countering terrorism, and I realize this topic is broader than just terrorism, but I'll start with that. When we looked at military, law enforcement, intelligence means, we have more terrorists today than we did on 9/11, so we're not winning. And arguably, with the role of technology in our society today, much more dramatic than it was 20 years ago. All we're actually seeing is the tool, which is neutral. The tool itself is neutral. It has good, it has bad in the hands of human beings. And we're all wrestling with how do we channel it more to the good than the bad, right? And I think we have to keep going back to the individual. We don't want to accidentally perpetrate or perpetuate and have more terrorists 10 years from now because we deplatformed them all and they've all gone to these smaller platforms. That's what I worry about. At the same time, I'm in full agreement of the decisions that were made in January of this year to deplatform certain individuals and certain groups. I think we were at a moment of significant crisis and potential for violence, and that was the right call. But now that we have a little bit of breathing room, we really need to think through what do we do to help the individual, and that's where I think technology can play a role on more on upstream before they are to that place where they feel like they need to be deplatformed, or the companies feel they have to deplatform because they've posted too much. But we can see those signs and indicators that they're on that radicalization path, and we need to get that individual help. There's lots of ways to do it. There's ways to do it that prevent or protect privacy, and protect their ability to express themselves. But the underlying drivers are not, it's not the hate speech itself. There's something else going on with that individual, and that requires more of a one-on-one engagement to help them. That is offline. So it's somehow we gotta help the people that are online searching for this harmful content, get them offline to somebody in a community that can help. And that's why I think so much of what we've done today and trying to, or the last 3 days, and connecting these different disciplines is really critical, because a multidisciplinary approach to prevention is the only answer. And it doesn't happen if you just stay in your silo of offline or online. You have to be connecting them. There has to be a complement. So that's, if I could encourage the tech firms to do more, I do agree with the big broad picture that David painted. At the same time, if we're just looking at more very practical things, I would love to see them engaging more and getting people help earlier in the process before they have to be deplatformed.
All right, so let's hear from at least one tech firm. So Nick.
Well, I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of industry peers, because I think the ways that companies think about these are actually increasingly different. I think to start with the point of incentives, I think the point is absolutely right, that when it comes down to how people interact with a system, with an algorithm, the incentives that those algorithms, those systems give will lead to humans behaving in certain ways. Some of those behaviors exist offline. And I think, Evan Williams, who was one of the founders, spoke about how when people drive past accidents on a road, we tend to look at the accident. Now, if you take that to a technology level, the concern is that an algorithm thinks, well, I should cause more accidents because the person reacted and looked. So I think there's a couple of different ways to think about this. One is that the algorithms are at the heart of how the incentives are manifested. And so the question often isn't just sort of, we should have no algorithms, but it should be perhaps that we should be thinking about how to give people more control and more choice over the algorithms that shape their experience. And right now, that's a very centralized process. It sits within companies. There's no real competition or diversity there. And so I think really thinking about how do we give people the ability to control those algorithmic experiences, that has a direct impact on the incentives, will have a direct impact on the types of content that are shared. And I think the development of that also is something that we've been working on, of thinking less about how do these systems base on individual people. And so on Twitter right now, you choose to follow a person. Well, actually, in a world where you choose to follow a topic, you're naturally hearing more perspectives. You're hearing from more people. And so that potential to bring in a broader range of thought to people's online experiences, again, changing the incentives, changing the way that the technology and the people interact, and then direct intervention. So we were quite direct with people and said, you haven't read this, are you sure you want to retweet it? And we show 40% of people actually said, actually, I won't retweet that. And so there are also opportunities for companies to add friction to processes. And again, that might result in fewer retweets, fewer people sending replies, posting tweets. But if that moves the overall health of the conversation in a positive direction, actually it's worth intervening to reduce engagement. And I think that's certainly how we're approaching these challenges. Is some of this is the companies direct intervening. Some of it is giving people more choice and control in ways that reduces the influence of algorithms on what they see. And then some of this is also about changing the incentives at the heart of those algorithms, so that the most shocking, the most controversial content isn't the content that is also the most amplified by algorithms. So there's a lot of different things, and different companies have different approaches, but I think there's real progress in actually saying that we don't have to take for granted the current architecture, the current models. So
it's complicated, and getting it right is difficult. I hear a lot about needing to have better algorithms, having more control over algorithms. It sounds like maybe more investment in that, maybe more research. So speaking of research, one of my favorite topics, I've been going around talking to people and asking you for your research questions. So I'm going to ask the panel, what do you think are the big open research questions where we could benefit from having more research that would help give us some empirical support for what directions we should be going in? Elizabeth, would you like to start this time?
I will start. I have lots of thoughts. We, just by way of background, the federal government, which I've spent 20 years in and around the federal government, so that's, when I say we, that's what I often mean, even though I don't work there anymore, spent about 10 to 15 years to work to figure out prevention. Could have done it faster, but as with everything in government, there weren't enough resources, and quite frankly, government was scared to try something new. About 2 years ago, David mentioned, we wrote a strategy that documented our approach to prevention. We got Congress to buy into it, they funded it, and then COVID happened. There's still some progress that's been made, but it's been impeded by as everything has been over the last 2 years with COVID. What I'm most excited about is that we're actually trying something based on evidence. Rand did a landmark study for us, looked all around the globe, looked at what, you had Richard Aborn here yesterday from New York City, doing what they're doing in DEEP, looking at what Colorado is doing. They've run 1,200 interventions in 5 years, and came to the conclusion that prevention works, it's under-resourced, and it needs to be locally based. The previous federal efforts had largely been run out of Washington, D.C. That doesn't work. So we actually have a roadmap. We know where we want to go, but we don't actually have longitudinal studies of individuals that have gone through intervention programs. And that's really hard to fund longitudinal studies out of the federal government because they tend to run on either 1-year cycles or 5-year cycles. And what I really want to know, I mean, this is our best effort so far. There is a ton of evidence here that this will work. But I really would like to know what happens after an individual is intervened with, they are put on a threat management plan, they stick with that plan, they get to the other side of whatever that time period was. Where are they in 5 years? Where are they in 10 years? Where are they in 20 years? And I would love to better understand is if you have an entity, DEEP is associated with NYPD, but they are not a law enforcement entity. Colorado's prevention effort is run out of the University of Denver, but in partnership with state and local governments, but it's not owned by law enforcement. Does it matter who owns or who is the primary coordinator? Does it matter if it's coming out of, if the funding's coming out of the Department of Homeland Security instead of Health and Human Services? That is another question that I think I would love to see studied. I think we're going to have different states take different approaches. I think that's great, and I think there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. But I would love for us to be able to study if there are differences in outcomes based on the players involved and who is leading.
All right. Nick, do you have a wish list of research questions?
Well, I'm going to do that classic policy person of say there's a policy problem first to get to the research, which is actually the legal frameworks. One of the big interplays that we have to deal with is if we remove tweets, if we remove accounts, that data is no longer publicly available. So the legal framework that allows us to give that data to researchers, to civil society organizations, is really unclear. And so I think one of the most important things for policymakers is to identify how they can set a legal framework that encourages and enables services to be able to share more data with external experts so they can actually do the kind of research we're talking about. In terms of practical lessons, I think, firstly, again, this idea of just what works. At Twitter, we have a range of different levers we can pull, interventions we can support, and the holistic kind of human-oriented research that works with different specialists in different sectors to help us identify what's effective is incredibly important. And then thirdly, I know, particularly thinking about offline violence, there was an FBI study several years ago that looked at the link between domestic violence and future acts of gun crime. And I think the ICSR, which I think did some interesting work in the UK, where they were given access to interview a number of people who were in prison after being prosecuted for terrorism offences. Those kind of in-depth studies that actually require law enforcement and judicial cooperation really help build a detailed picture of early indicators. And those early indicators might be for law enforcement, they might be for social and local human services, or they might be for technology companies. But those early indicators and identifying them are really important, I think, to help scale up these responses, again, not just for one or two big companies, but across the wider ecosystem.
So you said that changes to the legal framework were needed in order to share data with researchers. So what are the legal obstacles to sharing data with researchers?
Well, I will share with you the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism Legal Framework Working Group produced a paper exactly on this topic. So I'll drop it in my chat. Hopefully that can be disseminated out. But in particular, it was this question of when content is removed. If it's publicly available, academics can use it, can research it. If it's removed, then particularly in the US, the provisions of things like the Stored Communications Act and ECPA kick in. And then you have a legal framework that requires legal process. And so I think the question is, can you either find a way of giving a broader range of actors access to that information, and that's researchers, civil society groups, or is there a way of actually enabling companies to be proactive in sharing that information? And I think that's something that, from a policy point of view, would benefit from movement and a clearer framework, because many of these topics were set out in law long before the conversations we're having about content moderation began.
All right.
I would want to study the impact of civility on the issue sets we're talking about, disinformation and extremism. As Nick mentioned, if you tweak the algorithms, and if you tweak some other things, we'll talk about what I think could be tweaked, you end up with a different climate. So one thing that interests me in terms of following online discussions is vaccine debates. This interested me long before COVID. I'm pro-vaccine. But when I look at, no applause please, but when I look at these debates online, I find myself somewhat sympathetic with the vaccine skeptics, because the temperature on these discussions is so ramped up. Again, this is pre-COVID. You'll have people who express some vaccine hesitancy, and the amount of names that they're called, how could you, you're endangering my kids. And if you think of it through the eyes of someone who has some skepticism but doesn't necessarily have a position, and what they're met with is you're a fool, you're a Nazi, you're putting lives in danger, suddenly you've taken someone who might well have been persuaded, and you've cast them into this community where they'll delve into much more extremes on the vaccine issue, and quite possibly other issues, just as one window. So to me, it's very easily measurable, civility versus incivility via sentiment analysis. And so as I said, what I would want to look at is what is the impact of civility versus incivility, basically looking at time samples for distinct communities over time on the spread of disinformation and on the pull of extremism or extremist content. And if there is a benefit to civility, the question then is, what can we do to encourage it? Stakeholders like tech companies, stakeholders like private firms, like civil society organizations. But to me, this is one of those key things that has eroded over the past decade in the online space. I was an early adopter of Twitter. If you go back to Twitter a decade ago, I was both a frequent user of it and I enjoyed it. I found it a space that I liked to spend time in. Today, and not just Twitter, I mean, the Facebook I never really spent a lot of time on, so I'm not trying to pick on Twitter, Nick. But today, it's a forum which I find not to really be worthwhile, in part because of the environment that exists in that space. I believe that it can be a better environment, and I think that there are unique social goods that link to trying to make all of our online spaces places where people are safer to express a variety of ideas and have them be heard and discussed in a reasonable manner.
I'm not sure that incivility is actually that new a thing. Having been on the internet a long time
not new,
myself,
but it's not new, of course, but I think it's clear that it has escalated.
Yeah. All right, Amar.
Sure. I think I agree with all of what's been said. I think I would add a few things. I mean, in terms of the data to researchers, I think that's fundamental. I mean, I think Nick touched on that quite well. There were several initiatives that Twitter took, for example, with the Trump account. They just flagged certain tweets. They Instagram redirected certain searches and certain keyword searches to GNet and other things. There's a lot of data around that in terms of the question of whether it worked, what actually happened, where people went, how long they spent on these websites, et cetera, which these companies have, but they haven't, for whatever reason, it's not open to researchers, which I think it will be quite useful. So I have in all caps share data, which I think is quite important going forward, especially as they're trying new things. And I commend Twitter, for probably being the most researcher-friendly platform out there, because they have a researcher-specific API, which is quite useful. Facebook has been going, I think, a bit in the opposite direction. The other thing I would add to Elizabeth's point is this kind of life story approach, which I think is more and more important, right? I've interviewed a lot of former far-right people. I've interviewed a lot of current jihadists. And what's significant, I think, when you talk to them about their entire life is how much more is going on other than social media, right? Other than what's happening in their online life, which I think sometimes, because that's the only way we interact with their content, we sometimes confuse what they're putting out and what they're making public with what's actually going on in all other aspects of their life. And so getting a broader sense of their life story, I think is important. The other thing, which I think is going to be more important, and there's actually not much research on it so far, is kind of digital innovation in the extremism space. There's a lot of research on innovation in the extremism space, but nothing or not much in terms of the online component of it. And what I mean by that is, Facebook takes an action or Twitter takes an action. How are extremist movements adapting to that, right? And not necessarily where are they going in terms of platform migration, but how are they actually reacting to that? And I'll give you a fairly basic example. Some ISIS accounts, for example, started to space out Arabic letters, right? So Arabic is a cursive script, and I guess they realized that if you write jihad in Arabic, Facebook is going to probably flag that in some way. But what they started to do was spell each letter with a space in it to try to confuse the algorithm or to confuse the system, right? And so minor little things like that they're experimenting with, that they're trying out, I think are important to look at. And Julia DeCook at Loyola University has some interesting work on the incel community, for example, on Reddit, and how they've, the kind of innovations that they've engaged in whenever there's been a takedown. The other thing I think, finally, just to kind of touch on David's point, which is hugely, hugely important, is why is it, I don't really know how you study this really, but I think the main trend that I've noticed, and I think he's noticed since 2013 till now, is minor political disagreements, minor policy disagreements have been elevated to cosmic levels, right? And so it's now become, I don't just disagree with your, with your opinion on a particular voting rights bill or whatever it is. It's now, no, you are the epitome of evil, and I am what's good. And we've all, I think, elevated the kind of nature of the conversation to kind of good versus evil, us versus them, so seamlessly that even the most mundane local school board disagreement is now like a Satan versus good debate, which I don't know how we got here, but I think that trend to kind of bring about some level of civility, that you're allowed to basically disagree with people on things and it's okay, I think is important, and kind of understanding how that process happened. Again, I don't know how you study that, but I think kind of picking that apart will be important going forward as well.
Okay, so I think we will end with a discussion of solutions. And I want from each of you either a practical policy solution or an out-of-a-box policy solution. You can do both, but only if you do it really fast, because you each have about a minute. We'll start with our remote participants and then a local one. So we'll start with you, Nick.
Well, I think the point about civility was well made. One of the strangest things, as being someone who grew up in the UK and then moving to America, was the cable news experience here. The difference between the BBC and, frankly, any cable news channel here, where I fully agree. It seems that I watch cable news and I don't know who I'm disagreeing with or should think is absolutely wrong, but someone's definitely doing something terrible, and there's lots of people shouting, telling me how bad everyone is. And I think Yochai Benkler's work on network propaganda certainly is illustrated there. So I think out of the box civility at all levels of public life, and for technology companies, more interventions and more innovation that allows us to try and improve behavior without escalating immediately to removing access to communication services.
Okay, and Amar?
Yeah, I think more choice, as Mick mentioned in the past earlier, is the thing I would experiment with and think about, as well as providing algorithmic choice to individuals, which might allow them to maintain the profit model that is probably a no-go zone for many of these platforms, but figuring out ways to work within that profit model to also make sure that it's not contributing to human rights abuses and other things is important. I think providing some element of choice with what you're presented with and how you're consuming content might be an interesting way to go.
Elizabeth?
I am going to frame this as things that I would love to see Eradicate Hate move forward. One, I would love to see in your next summit that you invite governors and or governors' staff to the conference. I think that's a key missing demographic. If we want to do prevention well, we need to educate and bring the state and local voices to the table, and trust that there will be many years of needing to listen to one another and learn each other's lexicon, come up with their own lexicon. It takes a long time to get a multidisciplinary group to do something well, but let's get them to the table as soon as possible so that they can help us start to build out this capability across the country. And then the other thing is kind of the complement. You heard John Piccarelli speak today and yesterday. It's his office, the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnership, that has grant funding to be able to try to implement this prevention capability across the country, and he has field staff. Those field staff need to grow. He's not allowed to advocate because he's a federal employee. You're not allowed to ask things from Congress. But I think Eradicate Hate should send a letter to Congress and say, you need to fund this office, you need to authorize it. There's draft language that's floating around Congress right now. It's hard to get Congress to do anything. But if a group of this caliber and size comes together and says, hey, this is too important, it's underfunded, how many billions and trillions of dollars have we spent on this other stuff that, policy debate whether or not it was worthwhile to keep our country safe. But we have spent infinitesimally tiny amount of money on the prevention capability. So authorize this office, scale it, make sure there's a floor of the number of people for his office so that we can get people in every state and every major city helping those states and cities build a prevention capability. Expand the grants, they're at 20 million. They're probably going to 30 million next year. That's the rumor on the street. It needs to be upwards of 200 million minimum within 5 years. Even that's probably not enough, but it's hard to scale much past that. So we need to increase that funding, and we've got to invest in mental health capability, behavioral health capability in this country, that they are the first line workers. They are what firefighters and law enforcement are for protection, response, and recovery. And prevention, they are the first preventers, and we don't have enough of them, and we're not taking care of them. So that's my plea, is that we actually get the funding to be able to implement prevention across the country.
Great, and David.
Piggybacking on Elizabeth's point about what Eradicate Hate can do, I'd like to wrap up the panel by offering a policy solution as all of us. This conference has brought together an incredible set of skills and disciplines, as we've talked about. I won't belabor the point, but this is a truly impressive assembly of many different voices. Community members, people who've had their lives very, very concretely and tragically impacted by hate crimes, people who've been studying this their entire lives. And I think we bring together very different parts of the puzzle. As we all move forward together, I think we need to understand that we're experimenting. Not every experiment will turn out the way we want, and so patience is important, but as you find what works, we should lean into it. Elizabeth said that Eradicate Hate can advocate for increased prevention funding. I agree with that. And I think Eradicate Hate should think of itself in a limited fashion as an organization that can engage in advocacy. I think that's important. I think this organization has a very important and credible voice, not least because it brings together so many different points of view. I was really impressed by the ideological heterogeneity of so many of these panels. As Amar said, we live in a world now where even the most mundane of policy disagreements can cause us to hate one another. But I think we're at our healthiest and our best if we understand our critics, and if our critics understand themselves as people who see the same problem, but are trying to build a sharper and better approach. I think collegial argument is an art that is not exercised as much as it should be. Ultimately, we gain more velocity and more ability to address this problem if we work together. And so my policy solution is to see this conference as a springboard and to make sure that we are all jumping from that springboard with one another.
All right, well, with that, let's give our panelists a round of applause.
Thank you.